Hello everyone and welcome to today's webcast. My name is Ben Frost. I'm the Public Information Officer for APA's Northern New England chapter, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Planning Webcast series. This series is brought to you by a consortium of over 40 of APA's chapters and divisions. The consortium itself is not affiliated with APA, but rather is a loose-knit association whose mission is to provide high-quality free webinars on topics important to planners that will also help them meet their certification maintenance requirements. Today is Friday, May 20th, 2016, and we'll hear the presentation, Forging Neighborhoods for All Generations. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found on the webcast toolbar on the right of your screen or call the 1-800 number shown. For content-related questions related to the presentation, please type those questions in the question box, also located on the webinar toolbar on the right side of your screen. We'll answer those, if time allows, at the end of the presentation during our Q&A. Here is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions, and I want to thank all of them, all of the participating sponsors, for making these webcasts possible. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Private Practice Division of APA. And here's a list of a few upcoming webcasts. To register for any of these, please visit our website, which is www.ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, follow these instructions. Go to planning.org, log into your account, navigate yourself to the CM page, search Activities by Provider by clicking the button at the top of the screen, type in Private Practice Division and select Forging Neighborhoods for All Communities, or you can search by the event number 9012934. This is approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only, so if you're reviewing the recording of this on YouTube, recognize that unless we've qualified this also for distance education credits, you don't get credit for that, only for live viewing. You can like us on Facebook, where we regularly post information, the most up-to-date information on the upcoming webcasts. We are recording today's webcast, and you can search for the recordings by logging into YouTube, searching for Planning Webcast Series, and finding all of the recordings that we have there. The PDFs of today's presentations will also be made available on the ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast webpage. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ramona Malahi of HUD, who will make a brief introductory presentation and introduce the rest of our speakers. Ramona, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben. I'd like to welcome everybody to this session. We're going to be exploring one of the trends that are happening throughout the United States and the world, which is an aging demographic. As you know, the world is aging. In 2006, almost 500 million people worldwide were 65 and over, which really represents about 8% of the world's population. By 2030, it's projected that the total will be increasing to 1 billion, which would be 1 in every 8 inhabitants. And also, we're seeing rapid increases of 65 and older occurring a lot in the developing countries. By 2050, more than 100 countries could have more than 20% of their population 65 and older. This slide sort of gives you a spatial analysis of what the aging population looks like in the United States based on the Census 2000. As you notice, the life cycle movement is one of the impacts in regards to moving young people from the Great Plains to areas such as where there's jobs and urban areas. We see also that the over age 65 can be found in recreational areas such as Florida, the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, as well as the Northwest, such as parts of Washington. By 2030, 1 in every 5 living in the U.S. will be over the age of 65, which roughly looks like about 72 million baby boomers aging through the life cycle in combination with a profound increase in longevity. This slide shows that the fastest growing group is the 85 plus. Currently, there are more than 70,000 centenarians in the United States, which is really 4 times the number from 10 years ago. So we are living longer, hopefully healthier. We can think of preparing for older age on both an individual and a societal scale. As this slide represents, when you think of an individual level, people need to focus, like for example, on preventive health, affordable housing, being able to, mobility issues, having enough money for retirement, how to stay connected to your family and your friends and to health needs, and really seeing whether you can access healthy foods. Population aging impacts also social entitlement programs. On the societal level, you can see the impacts on pension, health, long-term care costs, and that's associated with an aging population, which obviously leads to significant increases in public spending. And the safety net. It affects labor supply, savings, economic growth, and may demand new fiscal approaches as longer life expectancy and retirement may strain health and pension systems. As people live longer, the number of older adults living with one or more chronic diseases or disabilities common to age-related changes are also increasing, such as the explosive growth of Alzheimer's. Surveys have found, especially noted the AARP survey, that people over 65 want to age in place as long as possible. The challenge is how to make this work and how to obtain the support and care to remain as independent as possible. This slide shows modifications, home modifications, retrofitting, incorporating universal design principles and visitability standards are really an area that is gaining much traction, and as you see on the right half of the slide, obviously a profit center. As people live longer and have fewer children, older adults are left with fewer options for care, and the demand for services and support will rise. The new demographic reality really affects the ability of cities and communities to provide these resources and will obviously lead to significant increases in public spending. This really sort of demonstrates the urgent need to review and address our current policies in all facets of our community life. So there's a shift from looking at aging in place, which is more aging in your dwelling oriented, to looking at aging in community. What that means is that older adults are able to live as independently as possible as members of the community of their choice. It also means that growing older not only in your long-time home, but also taking a look at transitioning to a more appropriate and supporting setting as your abilities changed over your lifespan. During a lifetime, people develop connections to place and form, and they create important relationships within their neighborhoods and communities. The challenge is to sustain these relationships because, as we know, that also helps to age well. This slide sort of shares with you that some organizations have conducted surveys that serve as a barometer on how age-ready cities and communities are. This particular slide shows the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging, which is called lovingly N4A, United Health Corps, and the National Council on Aging, which conducts an annual survey on how communities can do better to support an increasing senior population. A 2010 nationwide MetLife survey revealed only limited progress in advancing the goal to create a livable community for all ages. Since this first survey that was conducted 5 years earlier, it showed that only 17% of the communities interviewed had plans that specifically address the needs and contributions of older adults. Now, the American Planning Association has developed a toolkit of resources to help communities better understand their options and approaches to develop a strategy appropriate to existing resources, needs, and assets, or crafting your own plan based on what's existing. The first is the multigenerational planning. All of this can be gotten online at the American Planning Association website, which is www.planning.org. So multigenerational planning, and Mildred, the next speaker, will go into it a little bit more, really is more of an intentional, holistic approach to addressing common needs across all age groups so that they can access shared services that are close by, and really taking a look at multi-use of resources and involving planning and engagement in a very inclusive way. Aging and Livable Communities Initiative is an initiative by the APA Divisions Council, and what it has are key resources online, including bibliography, articles, documents, websites, toolkits, data to better understand the context of the aging demographic, issues, best practices, to bring a focus to the opportunities and challenges of planning for residents across lifespan. Aging and Community Policy Guide is really to help the planning community be a leader in implementing comprehensive approaches and mobilizing resources to serve the range of needs for people of all ages and abilities. It's an insightful guide of policies, principles, and it's wide-ranging, and it's really useful reading. I think it's one of the better policy guides. The PAS report on the lower left is the newest report that came out last year, and it focuses on planning aging supportive communities. I like to think of it as like a Bible, a real resource in terms of identifying what's out there, looking at the resources, looking at strategies, taking a look at a planning process, and really helping planners and community officials to work to develop their own and craft their own plan based on what's happening out there. So it's like a compendium resource that I think is excellent. And finally, the Aging Community Policy Guide, which we mentioned on the right, covers areas that are common to all of these: community engagement, housing, transportation, land use, economic well-being, community assets, and supports. I added this slide because what I want us to remember is that as our population is aging, there is also a younger population, 0 to 17, that is going to be much larger than the aging baby boomers or people over 65. And another a transformation in regards to demographics is really a more racially diverse population as a whole. That's why closing the generation gap is critical by creating programs that foster contact, encourages social capital, shared experiences, and stories. So all the relative planning paradigms that you see on the screen is applicable by utilizing or embedding within each of these approaches the aging lens, the lifespan lens, to help craft solutions that will address needs across the board. Other tools in the toolbox are these useful paradigms. So you're not reinventing the wheel. And finally, there's been a number of ways that a growing number of communities across the countries have used in terms of approaches and community planning models to address the needs of their aging populations. whether they called it elder-friendly, age-friendly, communities for all ages, aging in place, community certification, lifestyle communities. For example, age-friendly Philadelphia is based on the EPA guidelines, and it highlights environmental and behavioral factors such as social connectedness, flexible and accessible housing, transportation, mobility, healthy eating, and how that can impact the long-term sustainability of seniors. So you add a shaded bus stop for seniors, but it also makes not only senior accessible, but it makes public transportation more of an option for the disabled. It also appeals to families as well. The age-friendly city is one of the approaches, and it shares some of the common themes. And we will have Melissa from ARP who will talk about that and deep dive into that particular model. And so what we hope to do in this session is really do a deeper dive in terms of taking a look at the different facets and perspectives of aging through a variety of lenses, including and then considering for your review a possible framework in which this would bring all of these mindsets, all of these approaches in one perspective. Now it's time to introduce our next presenters. Mildred, I think everybody knows Mildred. I think she's the go-to guru for a lot of things in regards to exploring models that really help planners to take a look at addressing the needs of their population. And she has a wonderful website, and she and Amanda will be sharing a session as they drill down in regards to the multigenerational aspect and planning across generations in the gender lens. Now Melissa, who is the guru in regards to the online Livable Communities newsletter, will provide us an overview of the age-friendly initiative that AARP with World Health Organization has. She'll give an overview of the network, take a look at the approaches that are being used, the current accomplishments, and some of the AARP resources that can help any community, such as the Livability Index that was introduced at the annual meeting last year. Already I forgot where we introduced it. But so these are the upcoming speakers, and I invite you to enjoy as we go about our journey. So now I'll turn it over to Mildred. Thanks, Mildred.
Thank you, Ramona. Once I get my screen, you'll need to share me your screen. Okay. I hope everybody can see the screen now. Amanda Miklo, who is a PhD candidate at Cornell University and a specialist on a gender analysis of looking at planning issues, and I have been working on issues around reframing the aging and livability debate. And one of the issues that Ramona pointed out is that we need a change in paradigm, and what we want to offer you today is the notion of a paradigm that I think could work quite well for looking at both aging communities and communities that are good for all ages. And so the idea here is that with the increased interest in aging on the part of planners, it provides an opportunity to think about planning for something other than the androgynous male commuter worker. I think that's really what we mostly have in our minds when we're planning, is this commuter worker, this genderless commuter worker. And as we think about aging, we realize we're not necessarily dealing with a commuter or a worker. We're dealing with someone who needs mobility and needs a variety of housing and options. It's more about living than working in the community. And I think this gives us a platform to begin to re-engage issues around gender. As Ramona suggested earlier, we also would like to see us take a multi-generational approach, because while our society is aging, we're also going to have more young people than ever before. And our younger generations are more likely to be lower income and persons of color. And so we really need to think about strategies that can bring us together across the generations and not divide us. And so what I want to suggest is that a multi-generational planning approach is not so radical, except it is kind of odd that internationally we have UNICEF with its focus on child-friendly cities, and we have WHO, World Health Organization, with its focus on age-friendly cities as really two separate worlds. And yet when you look at the issues that each group considers important, there are many common elements. So I think this suggests the possibility of coming together. We use this graphic of a woman in the middle with a kid on one side and an elderly mother on the other as a way to think about the needs of the very young and the very old, and the fact that it's those of us in the middle who are the ones who can make changes in this world. And we're also the ones that feel the burden of care for the young and the old. And that burden of care is still a gendered burden. Women still bear the majority of that responsibility. But if we have an inclusive planning approach that looks at physical design in an all-age friendly way and looks at the possibility of getting out of siloed and separate services into shared services, we have the hope that we might be able to build a common vision that will allow our communities to come together politically to do common planning work. So what we want to do in our talk here today is give you a sense of where is current practice. So back in 2008, we did a family-friendly planning survey with the APA and had over 900 planners respond. And then in 2013, we did a survey about planning across generations with over almost 1,500 city managers, and we did this with the International City County Management Association. Those are the two surveys I'm going to talk about, and then halfway through this talk, Amanda's going to pick it up and talk about a very recent survey that we did with the Planning and Women Division of APA on planning for women and aging. What's interesting about these surveys is that they found common themes. Number one, we planners don't give enough attention to these issues. That's why we're glad that we have almost 600 people on this webinar today. The second thing is that ignorance, lack of knowledge about what to do, is actually our biggest barrier. The third is that the nitty-gritty details of planning and zoning can really make a difference. And finally, that participation of elders and families with children is key. Now, what are we talking about? What would a gender lens look like? Well, it looks really similar to the kinds of issues that Ramona was raising on an aging lens. You want to have multiple types and multiple uses for housing. You want to have a transportation framework that's about mobility and not just commuting. In the services area, you need to pay attention not only to the formal services in your economy, but also informal services, because much of the care work is actually informal. And what can we do as planners to facilitate more informal neighborhood and household supports? Civic engagement is key, but we need to think about participation modalities that encourage children, youth, parents of young children, and elders to participate. On the economic development side, many planners across the country are starting to look at issues like child care as one of the critical components or a social infrastructure for economic development. And finally, we have to look at intersections, because when we take an all-age approach, we need to recognize that there are linkages between housing, transportation, services, economic development, and we need to come together on those. Now, these are all elements that are in the APA Aging Policy Guide. What we were wondering is, what drives change? So in the 2008 Family Friendly Planning Survey, we found that those communities that had more action to support environments and services that were better for families with children were ones that paid attention to the nitty-gritty details in site planning and zoning and had families participate in the planning process. That's what led to action. But action led to resistance, because you do get NIMBYism pushback. But when we looked at what drove resistance, we found that ignorance was one of the biggest pieces. So if you can do an education process in your community, this can help to address problems with resistance. We also found that comprehensive planning can actually promote resistance, because of the values that get expressed in the plan can sometimes lead other members of the community to say, no, we don't want to address this. But as we've looked in the more recent surveys, we've found that comprehensive planning can have a positive role on action. Let me take you to the next survey, which was the Planning Across Generations survey in 2013, which surveyed not planners, but city managers. And we asked about attitudes, actions, zoning, and planning. And what we found was that the built environment is not optimal. You're actually more likely to have an age-friendly community if you're in the metro core. Suburbs and rural areas, which have a higher percentage of elders and children in their populations, are less likely to have the physical built environment features that we generally consider to be age-friendly. You'll have a consolidated school, not neighborhood-based schools in a rural area. Sidewalks. You don't even have them in rural areas. The notion of a park or playground within a half mile or access to fresh food markets are also challenges. So when you think about the rural, suburban, urban difference, there's this gradient of urban places actually having built environments which look to be more favorable, and many of these features have to do with walkability. The urban environment looks more favorable than the suburb or the rural. When you look at our zoning regulations, which is the possibility that future development would be more age-friendly, what you see again is a metro-suburb-rural gradient with the metro core communities leading the way. So the need for bringing our zoning regulations up to speed in suburbs and rural areas is one important issue. And the other thing is to begin to think about what might be uniquely rural and suburban approaches to this problem that might not be new urbanist in form. Finally, with respect to service delivery, again, we see that service delivery also lags in both suburbs and rural areas. Then I want to talk about cross-agency partnerships, because we've talked about the needs of intersections between housing and transportation and economic development. And what you'll see where the little red check marks are, transportation or highway department, least likely to collaborate with anybody else. Planning department, not very highly ranked either. Economic development agency, nope. Housing agency gets a little bit better. So if we think that cross-agency partnerships are important, which I think they are, we as planners need to step up and begin to do more of these cross-agency collaborations. Now, how are we going to get more attention to the needs of children and seniors in our plans? So we ask on the survey about emergency planning, comprehensive planning, and economic development planning. And more communities are likely to do emergency plans because these are required. Comprehensive plans and economic development plans are less common. Giving attention to the needs of seniors and youth is most likely in the emergency plan and least likely in the economic development plans. So this is saying that your plan has some language that's specific to the needs of children, youth, families with young children, or elders. Now, why would that language matter? Well, it turns out that we did regression models on these 1,000 respondents, and what we found is that in communities where they engage elders and children in the planning process, their comprehensive plans are more likely to address the needs of aging and children. And when they do that, they're more likely to have more services for children and elders, and they're more likely to have zoning rules that promote a more age-friendly environment. And communities that have more zone rules that promote those environments tend to have better built environments and better housing. This is not news to anybody in planning. We know that this matters, but it just reinforces the critical importance of engagement of elders and children, the role of comprehensive planning, and particularly the role of zoning. That's really where the rubber hits the road, and those are the specifics that we need to pay attention to. Now, in thinking about this work, we've developed an idea of a model for this work that if you think about this orange line as being your average capacity as a child gets born, learns to walk, ride a bike, gets their driver's license, becomes an adult, is able to get around, and then as you get older, you may lose your mobility. It's for those at the two ends of the life cycle that inclusive design really matters because it can enhance their independence. But for those of us in the middle of adult life, it also improves our capacity because we don't have to spend as much time carting around our children or our mothers. And where you're in an environment where inclusive design has sort of reached its limit, or you can't do it, your rural area doesn't have sidewalks, then you need to think about service provision as being the complement that enables full capacity in an enabling environment. Now, we had hoped that this would be what we would find when we looked across communities. Instead, we found this is an aspirational model. What we actually see is that communities that have the best design have the most services, and communities that have the worst built environments have the least services. So we actually have a lot of work to do. So what we're wondering now, as we shift to this age-friendly paradigm, we're also wondering if a focus on women can help us better meet the needs of children and elders. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to give us some background on a gender lens. Amanda.
Thank you, Mildred. And so the slide that you saw right before that, can a focus on women help meet the needs of children and elders? The answer is yes. The woman in the center of the graphic is not only responsible for the care of both her child and her mother, which is dramatically affected by our built environment and service provision in her community, but she is also affected in similar ways by the built environment as those she cares. So why gender during a focus on aging? And I think it's mostly because there's a large overlap, and it's something that's come out of discussions that Mildred and I have had, and we've had in numerous APA sessions and focus groups and discussions with practitioners, is that there's an overlap between the burdens that women face and the built environment that disadvantages an aging population. And also that women of all ages are disproportionately impacted by the androcentric, and what do I mean by androcentric? I mean the male-centered manner in which we plan our communities. And what do I mean by the male-centered way in which we plan our communities? This is a largely post-war planning scheme in which planning assumes that men are the primary wage earners, that they are going to have the support of women who manage the non-wage earning requirements of household reproduction. So that means the man is going to go to work and the woman is going to stay at home and be the house maintainer. He's going to be the breadwinner. She's going to maintain the house. And the urban environment is going to be structured for the purposes of wage earning. And so why gender? Because we start to see a link between those two. And so women also face a triple burden. The triple burden is a responsibility for housework and childcare, which is continued, increasing labor force participation in either the informal or formal sector, and both of which of these are exacerbated by the spatial constraints of an inadequate physical design of our communities. These three things combine to result in a triple burden. And the spatial constraints that we work with refer to the separation of workplace and residence, the location of child and elder, limited transportation options, and restrictive family definitions. Women are forced to navigate a landscape that reinforces these outdated ideals of gender and household composition, as well as controlling the location of support services and alternative forms of residential development. So I will provide kind of a brief background theoretically and historically for this link between gender and aging. So the first ordinances were hierarchical in their form, which meant that most land use, the prohibition of nuisances was the first way that land use was regulated in the United States. However, with the growth of our cities in the turn of the 20th century, it was realized that the prohibition of nuisance was no longer adequate to deal with the problems of urban blight and early suburbanization. And so the first zoning ordinance was enacted in 1916, and hundreds were enacted in the next 10 years after that. They all followed this hierarchical model. And what that meant is that uses were prohibited from the uses were prohibited from the zones below them. For example, residential uses could be in commercial and industrial zones, but industrial zones could not be in commercial or residential zones. And so this form of land use regulation, our first zoning ordinances, really encouraged the creation of residential zones that contained little except housing. And so what we start to see with this was the forced separation, beginning of the forced separation of the residence and the workplace that we start to see mostly in the post-war period. And so I'll take a brief moment and talk about the social construction of planning and gender and social norms. And so what this slide illustrates is that planning practice generally replicates what we're seeing in society. And so when we start to see the first zoning ordinances, those were developed to bring order to the cities that were built with chaos of the tenements, the stuff that we read about in the early 20th century. And so the first zoning ordinances were really meant to bring order to this city. And so once the zoning ordinances became ingrained in the landscape, it started to reflect the social norms, and social norms then changed in the post-war period. And so we have this cyclical process of social construction of planning practices. And one of the most important things is the reinforcement of the single-family lifestyle in planning. And the single-family lifestyle not only impacts women, but also people of all genders and the aging population. And so the first court case that really reinforces single-family lifestyle was the Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty in 1926. And so what this did is it was the first case that legally upheld zoning, and it affirmed the zoning as a valid use of the state's police power, and also expressed a preference for single-family homes. In this case, the court held that very often the apartment is a mere parasite constructed in order to take advantage of the open spaces and attractive surroundings created by the residential character of the district. And it continues to go on about apartment houses followed depriving children of the privilege and quiet of open spaces for play. And finally, the residential character of a neighborhood and its desirability as a place of detached residence are utterly destroyed by the allowing of apartment complexes. And so this is the first court case that the Supreme Court really legitimated the belief in the rightness of a single-family lifestyle. And I think it's important to note that between 1916 and 1926, as we start to see this belief in the rightness of the single-family lifestyle, we also started to see a decline in the multi-generational family. And so as the nuclear family in the United States started to gain popularity in the post-war period, as that increased, we also saw a decline in the multi-generational family. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we were starting to zone them out of our residential areas. And so as a result of Euclid, valuing single-family dwellings as the highest and best use became the most common method of regulating land use. However, in the original sense with Euclid, single-family was meant, and in the first zoning ordinances, single-family was meant as a designation of the structure. However, it was a very short leap to become a municipal interpretation of the occupancy of that structure. And in the post-war period, as with rapid suburbanization, those occupants, desired occupants as ideal occupants, became the nuclear family. And this shift between the occupancy, between structure and occupancy, had a lot of impacts both on women, family structure, urban form, especially as, and again, in the post-war period. And so what we started to see with the change in societal and family constructs is a change in zoning. We went from having a hierarchical zoning to a non-hierarchical zoning, typically known as Euclidean zoning, which is what we as planners are all familiar with today. And this is the separation and privileging of the residential from the commercial and the industrial. So no longer was this a mixed-use hierarchical zoning, but really a separation and segregation of uses in an autocentric design. And so what we start to see is the prohibition of all uses mixing together. Again, in the post-war planning cycle, what we see is this becomes evident in what Betty Friedan named as the problem with no name. And so women became isolated by this post-war construct of a suburban housewife. When there was only one car, the woman did not have access to it. So during the day, she was isolated at home to force with childcare. The separation of workplace and residence, again, isolated her. The supply and location of childcare was not convenient, so it forced the burden of childcare onto women, which women are still dealing with greater child care burdens today. This post-war structuring also limited transportation options. There's not public transportation in these divisions. If you require reliance on an automobile because of the separation between workplace and residence, and workplace doesn't refer to just where people are going to work, but also where services are provided. So you need a car to get to the doctor, to get your children to school, for now daycare options. And then also, finally, these older zoning ordinances also had really restrictive family definitions. And so what happens is that means that any person that chooses to live in a non-traditional family type outside of the nuclear family, for example, the Golden Girls, would actually be prohibited in many zoning ordinances because they're not related by blood, marriage, or adoption. And so that's what the landscape looks like today. This slide actually looks very similar to the spatial constraints from earlier because not a lot has changed between the post-war era and today, and women are now facing this triple burden, which is the continued responsibility for child care and elder care, as well as working, and we are still planning for the housewife of the post-war era. And so briefly where we stand today, and you'll see some overlap between this, is that women have different employment opportunities. They're more likely to be in poverty. They have different commute patterns. They also spend more time on household activities, and 60% of caregivers of adults are actually female. And so we see a lot of overlap between this and aging, and this is kind of where we started to leverage this aging in women and planning in women, is that women, older women are more likely to be in poverty, older adults are more likely to be in poverty, older adults are also more likely to have transportation limitations, as well as service and care limitations. So we started to see a lot of overlap between the demographics facing women and the demographics facing, or the barriers facing older adults in our communities. So this is where we started to link gender and aging, and we launched a collaboration between the APA Planning Women Division and Cornell's Women's Planning Forum. In 2014, we did a focus group at the APA convention, and we ran a national survey of over 600 planners in which we asked questions about what they were doing regarding comprehensive planning, transportation, and land use, which I will go to in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. And as part of this collaboration, we also launched a workplace dynamics survey. The results of that will be forthcoming, that asks planners about the gender dynamics of their workplace. And so the motivating questions for one part of this analysis, we asked about 40 questions in this survey, but what really motivated this was wondering if communities are actually planning with a gender lens in terms of their comprehensive planning, their transportation planning, and their land use action. And if they are planning with a gender lens, what are the drivers? And again, why this is part of this webinar is because we saw such an overlap between the needs of an aging population and the needs of women, and that if you plan for one of these populations, it will likely better impact those communities. So returning to the argument that a better community is one where we plan for all generations and all genders. So with that, we moved forward, and I'll just briefly go over the results of comprehensive planning and transportation. So comprehensive planning, we found that only 2% of comprehensive plans pay attention to the needs of women, and what that means, there's any language in their comprehensive plan regarding gender. We compare this with 55% of plans that pay attention to the needs of aging. So we're starting to see a little bit of where aging is starting to, again, as Mildred said, come to the forefront, but gender is still slow behind that. With respect to transportation planning, there's a lot more questions on this, but broadly about trip chaining and or complete streets. We asked about trip chaining because women are actually more likely to engage in trip chaining than men, and this is because of the location of, again, the services, child care, elder care, and the separation of all of these. So women are more likely to drop their child off on the way to work and then pick their child up from child care and then run an errand on their way home from work. And so we were really curious about trip chaining, and we found that only 22% of communities address trip chaining in their planning, whereas 51% of communities design roads with space for biking and or walking. So when communities are redesigning roads, there is an attention to other alternative transportation options. And then finally, we looked at gender-sensitive land use in this analysis. And what that broadly meant is the location of whether or not communities allowed child care and elder care in residential zones, whether or not there were opportunities for home-based businesses, there'd be an expansion of housing options, and there wouldn't be restrictive family definitions. And so when we think of what gender-sensitive land use would be, these would be the kind of 4 ideas that would encapsulate what gender-sensitive land use actions would be. And so what we found when we tested these, that we found that 46% of communities allow child care in residential areas by right, 37 allow elder care in residential areas by right, and 52% of communities allow home-based businesses in residential zones by right. So we're finding that, in fact, a lot of these communities are providing for some of the needs of women and the elders by allowing these by right. In terms of land use actions, we also looked at housing. Allowing accessory apartments provides affordable housing and multiple housing options for not only women but also for the aging population. And again, allowing retrofitting of single-family houses for more than one family also would benefit, allow all different alternatives for women and also for the aging population. And then what we did lastly was run a regression on gender-sensitive land use actions. So the communities that engage in gender-sensitive land use, they allow child care and elder care in residential zones. They have opportunities for home-based businesses. They have multiple housing options and non-restrictive family definitions. We wanted to know when communities had those, what were the motivating factors for that? And so we thought it would be community attitudes and comprehensive planning. And these are the things, as Mildred presented earlier, that we found in other surveys that motivates planning actions to occur. And so what we found when we ran a regression of comprehensive planning and community attitudes on gender-sensitive land use was that comprehensive planning really drove communities to engage in gender-sensitive land use actions. But when we disaggregated comprehensive planning into planning for women and planning to aging, what we really found was that it was comprehensive planning for aging that really drove communities to engage in gender-sensitive land use actions. And so a gender-conscious community, gender-conscious planners and developers, they really didn't have any impact on gender-sensitive planning. And so what we're finding again is that gender is riding the aging train. Communities that tend to be gender-sensitive also tend to be aging-sensitive. And as Mildred had said earlier, I think that this provides a really great opportunity to open a discussion and a conversation to move forward about issues of gender and how to improve our communities for women because there is such a great overlap between aging and such a great momentum between aging right now.
So with that, we'll turn it over to Melissa. We want to make you aware that on our website, mildredwarner.org/planning, a number of these reports are available. An article that Amanda and I wrote, Not Your Mother's Suburb, quite a fun one to read if you want more of the background. The summary of the survey, The Need to Plan for Women, and then the other 2 surveys that I mentioned, Family-Friendly Planning and Planning for All Ages, are also there as well. So with now, I'd like to share the screen with Melissa Stanton.
And I'll take this time to remind people to start asking your questions by putting them into the question box.
Hello. I'm setting up my program. Let's see, show my screen. Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Stanton, and I am representing AARP as part of this webinar. AARP has a program called AARP Livable Communities. We are an education and outreach program. We have a website that I hope that you'll all visit at aarp.org/livable. And as Ramona mentioned, we have an e-newsletter that we put out weekly that is targeted to planners such as yourself, elected officials, and community residents who are community activists or just residents interested in what can be done to make their communities more age-friendly. My colleagues on this webinar spoke about the changing age demographics of our nation and the world. So I'm not going to talk too much about the baby boomers. You know who they are. They are approximately 76 million American children were born between the years of 1945 and 1964. And those babies are now, oops, I am stuck. Oh, there it is.
ranging in age from 51 to 71 years old. By 2030, 1 out of 5 adults in the U.S. will be 65 or older. So what I'm going to be discussing is not just the demographics of our nation and the world, but the impact and influence, and my previous presenters talked about the impact and influence planning has on our past and planning will have on our future. I'm going to talk a bit about the programmatic community-based framework for how elected officials, professional planners, and residents themselves can influence and create the change we need. So I'm going to go back for just a second to explain a bit about AARP for those of you who might not know. So AARP, is a nonpartisan membership organization that helps older adults, which we define as people ages 50 and older. But unlike when AARP was founded in 1958, AARP no longer stands for the American Association of Retired Persons. That was the original reason for our acronym. We now go by AARP or sometimes ARP. The reason we're no longer the American Association of Retired Persons is that people aren't really retiring. In 2012, 26.8% of people ages 65 to 75 were still in the workforce. The Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that the rate for this age group will continue increasing, and within just 6 years we will have over 30% of the U.S. workforce will consist of people between the ages of 65 and 75. Okay. Unlike in prior generations of older adults, which we used to refer to as senior citizens, most do not want to live in retirement communities. This is an image from 1975. This is actually my grandmother, who is from New York City, moved her family out to the New York suburbs, and her goal and my grandfather's goal was to retire to South Florida. And they moved into a community, a 55 and older community, where she could ride her tricycle, and there were community activities, and younger people visited but did not live there. However, survey after survey finds that today's older adults want to remain in their homes, and as Ramona mentioned, they want to remain in their communities. We find that we do surveys every few years asking what people's plans are, and their intention is to age in place. And I'm sorry, this one had a picture that has disappeared. The issue that we have is that most American homes have traditionally been designed and built for able-bodied 35-year-olds. And most of these homes, which have steps and narrow hallways and difficult ways to get in and out, have not been designed that they can be adapted. Oh, there it is. Okay. Survey after survey also finds that today's older adults want to remain in their community as they age. But again, as my colleagues have discussed, if you can't drive, you're kind of out of luck in most places. Most of the nation's communities are not supportive of non-drivers, and that becomes more of an issue as people age. When we do survey about what people want in their communities, these are the things they say. They want there to be a bus stop. They want to be able to walk to a grocery store or a park. These are things that features that they would like to see within a mile or less from their homes. It doesn't mean that these things exist, but that's what they imagine that they would like. And because of all of this, because we have an increasingly aging population in our nation, because there is the desire to age in place, because housing is not suitable for aging in place, because our streets are unsafe for non-drivers, because there's a lack of public transportation options, and due to numerous other factors ranging from employment, distance from family, health issues, isolation, urban and suburban sprawl, AARP has created the AARP Livable Communities Initiative, and we have established something called the AARP Network of Age-Friendly Communities. In AARP's policy book, we define age-friendly and livable communities as follows. A livable community is one that is safe and secure, has affordable and appropriate housing and transportation options, and offers supportive community features and services. Once in place, those resources enhance the personal independence, allow residents to age in place, and foster residents' engagement in the community's civic, economic, and social life. So this slide shows the introduction to our online toolkit for the AARP Network of Age-Friendly Communities. The reason we created it, we know that AARP in and of itself cannot make changes. We are not, the elected officials, the planners, the residents. What we can do is we can serve as a catalyst for educating, encouraging, and promoting this need, and recognizing the improvements that cities, towns, and counties do make to be more supportive of older adults and people of all ages. As Mildred and Amanda were talking about, we are looking at multi-generational, even though our organization serves the 50-plus demographic. We seek to provide America's cities, towns, counties, and states with age-friendly resources that they need by tapping into national and global research, models, and best practices. And we are working to engage locally to improve the lives of adults age 50-plus. So we see that we can help foster the change that is needed by reaching out to influencers, who are the elected officials, the planners such as yourself, and doing educational and outreach efforts to that group. But also we have a community of more than 35 million members in AARP, and we can also educate those residents and that membership that, status quo doesn't have to continue, that there are ways that we can make smart changes, and they can encourage the people in power to make those changes that will help them and generations to come. As mentioned before, the World Health Organization has a program about age-friendly cities and communities. Our AARP program is an affiliate of the World Health Organization program. We represent and manage the Age-Friendly Communities program in the United States. As you can see from this list, there are similar programs in other countries and internationally. Russia, Canada, Spain, Slovenia, United Kingdom. Ireland has a very active program. And I've highlighted in red a few words here. Membership in the World Health Organization program or the AARP program does not mean the particular community, the city, the town, the county, is age-friendly. What it means is that they are actively, committedly working to become more age-friendly. And this slide is to talk about what the network of age-friendly communities is not. And there is confusion, especially among lay people. They think that AARP has created a list of places where they should go live. And we get a lot of developers contacting us wanting us to endorse their 55 and older communities. That's not what this network is. We are not we're not talking about retirement villages or gated developments or assisted living facilities. Okay. Age-friendly communities is not a term that means old people places. We truly believe age-friendly communities are places that are great for people of all ages. Whatever you do to assist the transportation or housing or social interaction needs of an older adult is going to trickle down and be helpful to, you know, adults and children, people of all ages. This is the entry page to our online toolkit for communities once they come on. It is a self-guided process, although we do need to onboard the community and ensure that they understand what they're signing up for. So again, this is just trying to be very clear that being a member of the age-friendly network of age-friendly communities is not an endorsement of a community. What it is saying is that the community leadership has agreed to engage in a multi-step process of improvement. This is a map. It updates, you know, every week practically, of the communities that have signed on to join the network. And by signing on, I mean that the highest ranking elected official in the community has to agree to do this and commit to this. So it's either a mayor, you know, signing a proclamation, sending a letter, county executive, what top legislative body. You know, this is a long-term commitment. Communities are joining the AARP network of age-friendly communities because they understand what's coming and they know they need to get ready. Maine, by example, is one of the states and one of the regions that knows it needs to get ready. Maine is the oldest state in the United States. People often think it's Florida. Maine has a median population age of 44.1. Florida does have a larger percentage of the population are older adults, but Maine is facing this issue right now. These are the communities that have signed on from Maine thus far. Portland is on there. Portland's a city of several 100,000 people. We have communities on this list that are just 300 people that they have signed on to be part of this network and to start this work. This is just an example of some of the communities that have signed on already. What is missing from this list, because it just happened this week, is Los Angeles has signed on to work, actively work toward being more age-friendly. As I mentioned before, the process is a cycle. Communities start with step 1, where they're entering the network. After they enter and get onboarded, they actually have a 2-year planning phase. During this phase, they need to do outreach and do surveys and engage with the local older population, engage with other populations, and bring everybody together to discuss what the needs are and how to move forward. This is just a list of the steps. So we have getting started, then we have 2 years of planning. Then after an action plan is created, they move into step 3 and they start implementing off of that action plan. Then there's evaluation, and then it starts all over. This is a continuing cycle of improvement. Now we recognize, and the World Health Organization recognizes, that everything can't be done at once. And what the World Health Organization did is they divided the different needs of a community and individuals into what we call the 8 domains of livability. And the theory is that work within these 8 domains of livability help communities become great for people of all ages. So a large community, you know, a city, let's say a Los Angeles or a New York, may choose to engage and work in all 8 domains. A smaller community, such as the 300-member community that I mentioned up in Maine, they might decide what they can really do is work on number 4, which is social participation. Or maybe they're going to focus on transportation as a way of being able to get residents, older residents who have trouble with transportation, provide a service for them. So it's a framework that helps communities not feel overwhelmed that the problem is too large to solve. And this is just a slide and that we will show to when we make presentations to mixed groups. A lot of what I do and a lot of what we do at AARP is we are trying to translate and explain complicated, data-driven, data-intense ideas and information to what are essentially layperson audiences. And I will say this to you as planners, you're working with elected officials, some of whom have experience and a knowledge base, some don't, and who might never have heard of complete streets or 8 domains or aging-friendly frameworks. We create resources that are visual and simple so that they are easy to explain to people who either don't have the background or don't, frankly, have the time to read and plow through a lot of materials. So this is just a very simple explanation of each of the domains that kind of explains it, you know, just in a couple of sentences. It's been very useful for us. So as I mentioned, as part of the process, one of the stages is that members of the Age-Friendly Network have to make an action plan. And we launched the network in April of 2012. So just last year, no, the year before, I'm sorry, action plans started rolling in. So these are just a sampling. And you could see Honolulu, where Ramona is from, they issued their action plan last year. And these action plans are living documents. They will change. They should change as you know, different needs come up or progress is made. Work is also getting done. These are a few examples of some of the things that communities in the network of age-friendly communities have been doing, many of which we try to promote on our website. So quickly, number 1 is showing something called Le Tour de Ham, which is a slow biking group for people who like to bicycle but aren't into hills and long distances. So they talk about how they are a no spandex or fancy bike required group. This is a way to get people of all ages participating in a community event. This is not an expensive thing to do. You know, doesn't necessarily require infrastructure. If some of it is there, and obviously in Birmingham they did find places that are safe for people to bicycle. We program, in Brownsville, Texas. It is a program they started. Brownsville, Texas is a very impoverished community. There was a lot of obesity, and they created ciclovias or open streets programs so people of all ages could get out of the house and safely use the streets and bicycle and walk and learn things. Wichita, Kansas, we worked with them to do a community assessment about what the community's needs were. And in discussing and having these different groups, in-person meetings and surveys, the community discovered that there was a large proportion of grandparents who were caring for their grandchildren at home and had nothing to do with them all day. So the city donated a plot of land that was being unused and helped create a grandparents' park. for activities for little kids and benches and exercise equipment for older people. Newport, Vermont, which you would think that Vermont would have access to fresh food and be a very rural place. It is, but people in a section of the community did not have access to fresh food. There were no grocery stores nearby. If they had no car, they couldn't get fresh fruits and vegetables and produce. So they created their own intergenerational community garden. This is just our step-by-step guide to evaluation. This is available on our website that as the process goes through, as the implementation plan is implemented, need to assess. Is it working? Do we need to change? Ramona mentioned, and this is a wonderful tool if you are not yet familiar with it. It was presented at the APA conference, the 2015 APA conference in Seattle, I believe it was. It's called the Livability Index. You can type in a state, a county, a town, your house. You can type in the address of your house and calculate the livability score of a particular area. You can choose which measures you want to calculate. If you're only interested in transportation issues, you can just calculate to find out what the transportation score is of a particular community. We did this at the APA conference in Phoenix, and we just typed in where we were at that moment. And as you can see, we were in a downtown civic center kind of area. Engagement got low marks, but transportation got good marks, made an average of 51. This is a very useful tool. Data is pulled into it from dozens of different resources, and you can visit that at our website as well. Other resources we create, we talked a lot about housing and universal design. We will feature slideshows, articles, visuals about universal design, trying to explain to people that this, again, doesn't mean old person home. This can be a house for a lifetime. We have resources about community dwelling units, model legislation. We have resources for individuals who want to know what they might be able to do within their existing home. So our materials reach out to the professional audience, the developer and real estate markets, and to individuals. And I will just mention here, there is a program in Oregon where the community, the legislature in the local area created a program that if a house has been designed or modified with universal design features, the house can get a rating that they are able to put on real estate listings. And this is very exciting for that community because people who are looking for age-friendly houses or disability suitable housing can find that in the real estate listings and be able to target their search, and people can sell their homes, or developers can sell homes promoting those qualities. We develop placemaking resources and recommendations. Again, we are targeting to an audience of both professionals, but electeds and community activists. So we try to show, not just write about what we mean. We have a lot of transportation resources, articles, fact sheets, reports, slideshows. The slideshow here, called Dangerously Incomplete Streets, is visually explaining to people what we mean when we're talking about why we need complete streets, and that if they would just look around, they are surrounded by dangerously incomplete streets. That slideshow actually won an award. I mentioned we have an award-winning website, we have an award-winning newsletter. I ask that you visit the website or bookmark it, and if you want to subscribe to the newsletter, it is free, and the URL there is arp.org/livable-newsletter. Here's a sample of one of them. It is a combination of AARP resources, unique content that we have created and developed. We also do a brief roundup of some news articles related to the issues that we're all working on. And then usually at the bottom we are announcing different events, different programs that people could submit to, grants, foundation money, conferences, things like that. We also have an archive-based archive of A to Z archives where you can, if you're interested in Complete Streets, click and just see what materials we have related to Complete Streets. And again, our resources are about the subject, but also specific to our demographic. We're not comprehensive that we're going to have everything, but we're going to have materials that are specific to the older population. We also have, and I invite anybody who wants this to download, we have a one-page handout that shows the features of a livable community. This is helpful when you're trying to explain what you mean by livable community and complete streets and all of the issues we're working on. And this handout is available in 5 languages: English, Spanish, French, Korean, and Chinese. And that's available to download in 2 sizes. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to turn the presentation back to Ben. This is a slide with the contact information for all of us. So we hope to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. This has been a really interesting presentation, and I just want to say that, working in the area of affordable housing here in New Hampshire, our local AARP chapter has been a powerful and effective ally in helping us at both the local and state level in getting folks to adopt what we consider to be sensible, good housing policy. And I would say for anyone who is interested, the state of New Hampshire has just adopted a new law that will go into effect next year on accessory dwelling units. And that is that all municipalities in our state will have to allow for accessory dwellings in any single-family zone, which we think is pretty revolutionary. And for anyone who's listening, please get in touch with me if you want to take a look at the legislation. And we at New Hampshire Housing will be working over the summer to create some educational materials for municipalities. We do have a bunch of questions, and I want to get to those. There are some questions about, and I want to go back to Amanda and Mildred about the survey and some of the conclusions. This is from Gregory, and he asks, given the gradual shift occurring in some areas of the U.S. in which elder life expectancy of women appears to be negatively aligning with the elder life expectancy of men due to unhealthy and non-gender-based lifestyle-related problems such as smoking, obesity, illegal drug use, etc., and with the ever-increasing stay-at-home dad circumstances, hooray, I was one, does the potential exist for an eventual scenario in which your noted gender bias in comprehensive planning may not be present in the next decade or 2?
Yes. So gender means looking at all genders, and as men, like stay-at-home dads, or men who outlive their wives, begin to experience the same kinds of needs that we've been talking about that move beyond this worker commuter as the sole object of planning, then their needs will be met by a gender lens. A gender lens doesn't have to be a female lens. It's a gender lens, and in fact, it's unfortunate to say this, but when men have these needs, then they're more likely to be addressed than if they're just women's needs. Like the recent attention to child care is in large part driven by men who feel the need to address child care because they themselves are taking responsibility for the child care problems. So I think as as more men experience these issues and speak to them, they're more likely to get addressed.
Okay, here's a question from Jason. He says, I agree that planners are becoming more and more responsible for planning not only the built environment, but the social environment. What are some examples of cities that are successfully incorporating planners as resources in social resource planning, not just in zoning, land use, and built environment aspects? And that's for anyone.
I could take a start. This is Mildred. In terms of childcare, it's really been a wonderful revolution in the last 15 years of economic development planners deciding that childcare is a legitimate target for economic development planning activity. Traditionally, we've had the notion that only traded, export-oriented services are worthy economic development targets, and locally and household-serving sectors don't count. That is changing in large part because planners themselves are young and have children and say, hey, this sector really needs a lot of attention and I could use my tools to address it. I know Ramona mentioned the Maturing of America survey, which is a survey on 41 different services that are provided for seniors, from exercise to fraud prevention to home modification to Meals on Wheels. And planners play a role. What we've discovered in our analysis of that survey is that planners and the planning process play a role in not only stimulating a government response to these services, but in stimulating a market response by making the new market demands of an aging society more visible to even private sector providers. So we've found an important planner's role in service delivery.
Yeah, this is Ramona. I agree totally with Mildred, and you can see also in terms of APA, for example, a lot of our members are in the food planning end and the whole spectrum of the food systems continuum, and that leads to other types of more socially oriented priorities in regards to delivery systems, in regards to health programs. So, I mean, you know, the traditional perspective in terms of planning has been more on the zoning end, but as you know, planners with diversity in terms of interests and stuff like in housing are becoming much more facile in regards to addressing some of the major issues such as homelessness and housing.
Continuing on kind of a theme here, we have a question from Price, and the question is, baby boomers are a formidable voting bloc. Can we hope that as more boomers are unable to drive as they age, we will see our policymakers pay more attention to non-automotive infrastructure, or is the inertia of post-war auto-centric planning just too powerful?
Absolutely. The baby boomers have defined society at every stage in our life frame, and so you can expect us to define it again as we age. And one of the things we need to think about is we are in the position to design the world we want to live in. And we are enough of a voting bloc, and we have the experience not only in planning but in other professions. We know how systems work, and we know how to change them. My hope is that we will not be as selfish as we age as we have been up to now, and that we will widen our aperture of the lens that we look at this issue through and push for redesign of the environment that not only benefits us, but also benefits the younger generation. And that's why I think a multi-generational perspective is so critical, because we can design systems to pay attention to elders like paratransit and still leave out the mobility needs of young children and families with young children. And so that's where I hope that as we age, us baby boomers will work to create a society that's good for us, but also good for the younger generation in paying attention to these mobility needs, for example.
And this is Melissa. I agree with Mildred, and I'll just add one of the things that happens when ARP people show up at conferences, people do ask us about, I had a situation where a bunch of elected officials from small communities were saying they were constantly in a fight between the needs of the older population that wanted, you know, a new senior center and the families that were like, no, we need a new high school. And I said, what if you create a place that can serve both? And it was kind of this aha moment that we don't need to segregate our by demographics and age, that if you can create resources and infrastructure that serves everybody, then, you know, and actually boomers would be the best recipients of that, because boomers don't want to be in isolated senior-only senior centers. So that's one thing I would ask you guys to all consider, is shared space concepts.
I'm in the process of working on a film that is about how blind people and people with other visual disabilities navigate the built environment, and that'll be coming out soon. But one of the interviews we did was with a professional in the Boston area who works with people with vision disabilities, and one point she made, and I think that a couple of you have raised this in a way today, is that, and it was an alternative way of looking at the issue. It's not the people who are disabled, but it is the environment that is disabling. And that, for me, was a refreshing viewpoint, and kind of gave me a different look at kind of a problem that we've been facing for a long time. And as the boomers age, we're going to see a great many more people, a proportion of the population with vision disabilities. On the aging population, question from Tom. He asks, are any communities using time banks so the young elderly, and I'm trying to wrap my head around who the young elderly are, I suppose I'm one of them, so the young elderly can earn credits by giving an hour of service for the time when they are frail, elderly, and need such an hour of service? Anyone familiar with time banks?
I thought that they're using that in the village concept at Boston. We had some speakers from there, and they said that they're using that concept throughout their system.
And this is Melissa. There's a program. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Melissa.
There's a program called ITN America, which is based out of Maine, but it's national, and it's where people will volunteer to drive older people to doctor's appointments or whatnot, but they can bank, they earn credit, so when they need those services, they'll be available to them.
We have an issue brief on my website on informal networks, and it describes the ITN program. It describes some other kinds of service programs that have actually been coordinated by hospitals, so that when people go home, particularly if they go home to a home alone, they can get the kind of support services they need. And there's even a website, Nextdoor, which is sort of a social networking but grounded in place. So if people are interested in the way planners can support informal networks, time banks being one example of that, we have an issue brief up on my website that you could look at.
Thanks, Mildred. And we have a comment here from Esther. ITN America is using something similar to time banks, so I encourage people to look that up. Question here from Paul. Have there been studies concerning aging LGBT communities and the unique challenges they face? For example, no children or family to care for them, accepting communities, facilities, etc.?
The no children is a huge issue, and that's not just for LGBT. That's for large numbers of adults who will not have a younger family member to take care of them. The family definitions, I'm sure, Amanda, you have something to say on that.
So I think there's not been a lot of studies, but where we see a lot of the LGBT issues, where family definitions would become where you would be prohibited from living with an unmarried partner in certain areas if you had children, and especially as you become an elderly population, if you wanted to have a caregiver move in, a non-related caregiver, that would violate a housing definition, a basic family definition. And so where we see a lot of reinforcement of heteronormativity is in our family definitions, in this ideal single family that we push with those, and through the privileging of our single family.
Great.
And I think that we have an excuse me, Ben, I think we have an LGBT study that was put on the Aging and Livable Communities website that was either funded or supported by our APA LGBT division.
And if people go online, there's a program referred to as SAGE, Services and Advocacy for GLBT Elders. AARP has some involvement with that.
Okay,
as
great.
well.
We are now at 2:30. We've not been able to get to all questions, but I'll be sure to forward them to the speakers so that they can follow up directly with participants who have an unanswered question. So I want to stop now and take a moment to thank our speakers today. This has been a really great and informative session. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope that everyone online has as well. Join us in the upcoming weeks for our next webcast. We'll be taking next Friday off, but starting up for a full slate in June. Again, thanks everyone for joining today's webcast, and hope you all have a great weekend.